Hello, beautiful community. Let's rock and roll and react to not just Trump's call with Putin, and we'll read out Trump's summary of it, but to where we are with the Kremlin's latest position in the light of Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb. And we'll do this via reading 2 or 3 paragraphs and also challenging them, I imagine, a little bit by wonderful Russia specialist Tatiana Stanovaya. So Trump says, just had a package from Specsavers if you're in the UK, had some eye tests at home because my spectacles were lost with all my stuff stolen on the way back from the hospital. I've got a couple of very wonky pairs, and this is one of them. I just finished speaking by telephone with Vladimir of Russia, Vladimir Putin of Russia. The call lasted many hours, 1 hour, 15 minutes. We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine and also various other attacks that have been taking place by both sides. Our microphone is on. It was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. President Putin did say, and very strongly, that he'll have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. We also discussed Iran, and here Mr. Putin offered a little bit of support and cooperation, blah, blah, blah. President Putin did say, and very strongly, that he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. And what did you say about that, Donny? Well, Vladimir said it so strongly that I can only say how strongly he said it, and he said it that strongly that I've got to say that I'm going to say very strongly just how strongly he said it, because that's what he said, and I didn't say anything. Because I'm narcissistically dependent on him. Because I've invited him into a society of an imaginary kind in which he and I exist. It's very difficult for me to challenge him. It's quite a bit of violence that I got to do to myself to challenge Putin. I can conceivably do it, but it would mean de-inviting Putin from that fantasy society into which I welcomed him many years ago. And I don't think I'm prepared to do that for virtually any reason. For more, of course, watch the last main channel video when we discuss this sharply and in detail. So Putin's saying this to Trump. Trump's being compliant as always. Where are we at with the Russians now? Where is the Kremlin at? Let's read Tatiana Stanovaya together and react. I'm a very, very manipulative minor public intellectual with good intent. And that's to say, when I do this, I don't just mean to analyze a little argument about how to think about Putin and the war, but I always want to insert some general epistemic lessons that are ubiquitously applicable for us. Can I do that, please? A little bit manipulation like that. Is it allowed? Thank you. Benign manipulation. Almost sounded like Isaiah, but in a benign manipulation. Many in Western audiences view Ukraine's attacks on Russian strategic forces as a move that strengthens Kiev's negotiating position. These strikes demonstrate to Russia that Ukraine has capabilities previously thought unimaginable, and signal to the West that Ukraine retains cards with which to continue to fight. The idea is that the Kremlin, as a collective decision-making entity, will gradually be compelled to concede. So I think, and I agree with Stanovaya, that there are several motivations there, and she names a few. To compel the West to keep supporting Ukraine by showing Ukraine's efficacy. She says that. And to demonstrate Ukraine's capability to the Russians by making it clear to the regime that this is not going to be an easy war to continue prosecuting. But then there is also other motivations, right? demonstrating that Ukraine can carry on to Ukraine. How important that is. Not just persuading the Kremlin that the war will have big costs if they want to carry it on, but pushing the Kremlin, the regime, to lapse into internal conflict of the kind we saw with Putin versus Prigozhin. Ungovernability is Ukraine's greatest aim when it interferes on the Russian space. Overall, I would still argue even greater than the military impact of the damage, although the military damage is very considerable. And then, of course, there is just what we've said, the business of military advantage, taking out a percentage of Russia's strategic fleet, even though the plane numbers may not be as big a bottleneck as the number of missiles the Russians have. So there's a plurality of motivations, and it's understandable that Ukraine can miss on some of them and hit on others. However, Stanovaya goes on, in my assessment, the effect will be likely the opposite. Based on years and now decades of observing Putin's decision-making, I believe such attacks will only reinforce his determination to dismantle the Ukrainian state in its current form. That's an important sentence. Will only reinforce his determination to dismantle the Ukrainian state in its current form. He'll respond by becoming more hardline and less compliant. The perception that Ukraine's geopolitical orientation poses a long-term existential threat will harden, and his resolve to make it friendly will intensify regardless of cost. So, let's put ourselves in the mind of a bot-like mentality. And the bot-like mentality says, everything that's an argument against the other side or that sounds like an argument against the other side is good. Anything that's an argument against my side or anything that sounds remotely complex, I'm going to disregard. And if you're in that bot-like state, how do you react to what Stanovaya has written? Well, straightforwardly, you say, are you saying Ukraine should just lay down its weapons and not defend itself, and that Putin will then be tolerant towards its existence? Are you serious? Now, is that a good response? No, it's not. Because Stanovaya is not saying that Putin would then be tolerant toward Ukraine's existence if Ukraine became more passive and compliant. She's saying he's already very intolerant to Ukraine's existence, but that he can move to an even greater intolerance that will do Ukraine and the West a considerable degree of harm. So what Stanovaya is doing here, when she says this will only reinforce his determination to dismantle the Ukrainian state in its current form, is not creating space between tolerance for Ukraine's existence and intolerance. She agrees that the Putin regime is intolerant towards Ukraine's existence. She's trying to create space between something like extreme intolerance for Ukraine's existence and extreme intolerance for Ukraine's existence. Am I persuaded by Stanovaya here? No. I think that I'm unclear what practical political consequences fall out from this. I'm unconvinced how much practically meaningful space there actually is, as Tatiana argues there is, but I'm slow to recognize it, between a position of extreme intolerance and a position of extreme intolerance by Putin for Ukraine. Let me just make one observation. We are already on a course of collision between Russia and the West, which keeps escalating, even though we're not doing as much as we could to arm Ukraine and stand up to Putin. and would still be on that collision course if Ukraine from today onwards suspended all of its unconventional activities and just tried to fight the Russians at the front. That kind of passive stance by Ukraine and the perpetuation of the West's passive stance still puts us on a trajectory of escalation. We might skip a conflict between Russia and the West in virtue of various historical contingencies that occur, including biological contingencies. We might skip a conflict between Russia and the West in a very dark mode. If our democracies collapse in sufficient number, we will just be too ideologically and politically and culturally proximate to Putin's Russia to be in conflict with it. But if we keep most of our democracies in the West, we remain, even if we perpetuate our semi-passivity toward Ukraine, and even if Ukraine becomes more passive, on course for escalation rather than de-escalation with Russia. There are several important respects in which under-assertion against the Putin regime is escalatory. Let's go on. The West's greatest weakness in facing a desperate and confrontational Russia lies in its credibility. The Russian leadership sees no plausible way in which the West can win the war. And that, I think, is absolutely right. There's no doubt about that. A few comments appeared after Operation Spiderweb saying that Putin is petrified. And I replied to one of them on Twitter saying, oh, absolutely, he's petrified. He's petrified of losing power. But he's not petrified of Operation Spiderweb. He thinks he's winning the war as much as he's ever thought that he's winning the war. He thinks that he's going to make progress on the front line inevitably in the summer. He thinks Trump is not in a position to fundamentally challenge him. Trump's quote today is further evidence in that regard. He thinks the Russian economy will not collapse in a way that will challenge his regime, whether he stops the war or carries on the war for that matter. And he thinks that the West is fundamentally in decline, and that once the United States steps away from Ukraine, Europe will be unable to carry Ukraine. Everything structural in this dynamic favors me, he thinks. And Stanovaya claims that, and I believe she's right. Weapons deliveries, authorization for long-range strikes, completely unrealistic discussions of troop deployments, which thankfully have subsided. So it's causally part of why several European leaders were talking about troop deployment, that they knew they wouldn't have to do it. If they really thought they'd have to do it, they wouldn't talk about it as much as they did. Discussions of troop, and sometimes, of course, it is better to fabricate in politics, because fabricated optimism is better than no optimism at all, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes fabricated optimism is worse than nothing. Funding packages, all of that stuff does not convince Moscow that the West can reverse the situation on the battlefield. It will not change Putin's calculus, incite a palace coup, or spark a popular revolution. The current policies reinforce anti-West and anti-Ukrainian and pro-state sentiment in Russia. What's the alternative then? Now, presumably, Stanovaya's alternative might be to support Ukraine more. Let's read on. To be clear, I'm not arguing that the West should withdraw its support from Ukraine, for Ukraine, or that Ukraine should surrender. Rather, as a long-time Russian politics analyst, I aim to explain the current trajectory. Putin's Russia is now even more prepared to fight indefinitely, and increasingly convinced that it is winning and possesses the necessary resources to continue not only through 2025, but also into 2026. Well, that sentence is normatively impeccable. For me, I don't see anything wrong with it. But what kind of a self-destructive difference to this reality does Operation Spiderweb make via some difference between extreme and extreme intolerance for Ukraine? I'm less clear about. Stanovaya's last sentence. Moreover, there remains considerable scope of further radicalization and escalation. Striking at Russia's vulnerable points without sufficient military agency to defend and secure Ukraine is a course of action that may carry consequences many currently underestimate. I think it's a healthy warning. And I think to properly reconstruct it, we'd have to say that she's saying, look, let's support Ukraine, and Ukraine maybe could engage in some self-defense, unconventional self-defense moves on Russian territory. But if we're not supporting Ukraine enough, it might be dangerous for Ukraine to engage in such moves, even if it must. So Stanovaya is not necessarily saying that Ukraine shouldn't do this. It's saying that it may be that Ukraine has to do this, but it's going to be counterproductive. And that depends ultimately on Stanovaya creating that space between extreme and extreme intolerance of Ukraine, which needs to be created in such a way that we see what deleterious consequences follow from shifting Russia from extreme intolerance to extreme intolerance. We need to have a picture of what these consequences are. Let's say that that's one thing. Another thing is we need to be shown how it's possible, whether there is actually space at all beyond the extreme intolerance towards some further practically consequential and even more extreme intolerance. And we need evidence that if such space exists, and if deleterious political consequences come with Russia being pushed into it, that Operation Spiderweb is the kind of action that pushes Russia into it. 3. On none of these 3 am I clear which points Stanovaya is making, and therefore I find her piece powerfully provocative. But if I'm unclear about what she's talking about, everyone's going to be unclear about what she's talking about. So maybe I want a little bit more, because so far I'm not persuaded the space she's trying to create here has been created. But let us nevertheless make one very big, important concession, and that is that historically the meaning of actions states take, and much is true for individual lives too, doesn't settle until some time passes, right? You get rejected by some art school you want to go to as a mature student, and you're heartbroken by that because you really wanted to get in, but it turns out that's the best thing that could have ever happened to you, but you only discover that 3 years on, because you end up doing something else or going to some other art school that's even better. So we don't know exactly what the consequences of various actions are until history absorbs them to a degree. That means that all actions of substance Ukraine takes are going to fully take on their meaning once the war settles down somehow. And we are clear about what state Ukrainian statehood is in, what state Ukrainian sovereignty is in, or what state Ukrainian population is in, Ukrainian culture is in, Ukrainian infrastructure is in. So of course all of it depends. And of course you can run experiments which cannot be predictable. On the one hand, you can take a look at a dynamic like Georgia, where there is accommodation with a malign neighboring empire. And you can take a dynamic like Ukraine, where there is resistance. And it's possible that the accommodation 5-10 years down the line leaves a country with greater sovereignty than the resistance does. I mean, you cannot deny that that's entirely feasible historically. Moreover, it's even possible that doing the right thing, and the only thing you can do, like Ukraine resisting in 2022 Russia's full-scale invasion with this malign enterprise of orchestrating a coup in Ukraine's capital, the only thing Ukraine could have done is resisted. But it's possible that instead an alternate reality or a 10, 20-year period where Ukraine engages in some kind of, accommodation with Russia, ends up leaving Ukraine in a less bad position, or leaving the world in a less bad position. History is full of occasions where doing the only thing you can do and doing the right thing to do leads to an inferior outcome. So we're not trying to challenge the contingency of history here. We just don't know what the meaning of many things is today. However, having made this general concession, it seems to me that the particular distinctions Stanovaya is elaborating between, as I construe it, extreme and extreme intolerance for Ukraine with negative practical import for the West and for Ukraine, that's not entirely transparent to me, especially as Ukraine being more passive than it is, and the West being as passive as it is still leaving us on a course of escalation toward a greater degree of conflict, let's put it like that, between the West and Russia over the years to come. Lots of love.